to swap over. We now come to the backbench debate on financial support for small businesses and individuals during the Covid-19 pandemic. I call Manuela Perteghella, who will speak for a maximum of 15 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I stand to move the motion as on the order papers in my name. Before I start, I would like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for allowing us time to debate this important issue. I would also like to thank colleagues across the House for their tremendous support when I applied for this debate, and in particular, my honourable friend for Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr, who is the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Gaps in Covid-19 Financial Support, of which I am also an officer. I want to place on record my thanks to Excluded UK for their tireless and formidable campaigning. Without their work, many of these stories would never have been heard. Without them, many people would have been left to suffer in silence. They have shown persistence, compassion, and a commitment to justice. This debate is about a national scandal during the Covid-19 pandemic, which impacted millions of individuals and families, including mine. My spouse could only apply for a bounce-back loan when everything stopped. I want to speak about three things today. First, why I'm campaigning on this issue. Second, the people behind the statistics, including my constituents in Stratford-on-Avon, who contacted me in desperation and still feeling the horrendous impact of a policy decision by the then government to exclude them from any kind of financial support. And third, what needs to change. When COVID struck, the message from government was clear. Help would be there and no one would be left behind. The Chancellor at the time, the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton, vowed no one will be left without hope. For many, that was true, but for millions of others, that promise rang hollow. They paid in, they followed the rules, and when they needed support, they were told they did not qualify. People lost their income overnight, they lost their savings, their homes. I will give it.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. A genuine question, because I've obviously followed this campaign from afar. Could the Honourable Lady explain to me what were the reasons given by the government at the time for these people to be excluded in this way?
And I will get, thank you. Yes, thank you to the Honourable Member. I will get through to that in my speech. And some lost their lives. In Stratford-on-Avon, as well as up down the country, businesses owners ask a simple question. Why were they excluded when they had paid tax for years? These were people running events businesses, training services, consultancies, freelancers from the arts, music and creative sectors, and small companies that form part of the backbone of our local economy. This is the injustice that this debate seeks to address. It is important to say from the outset that we are not denying the scale or urgency of the government's response in March 2020. The coronavirus job retention scheme and the self-employment income support scheme were introduced at a speed and on a scale never seen before. According to the House of Commons Library, the overall cost of COVID-19 business support ran into tens of billions of pounds, and for many people and businesses, it prevented immediate hardship and business collapse. That context matters because it shows that the government was capable of acting decisively. The state was capable of dealing with a suite of diverse and complex scenarios. So the question is why, alongside that intervention, millions of people were left without nothing at all. They were simply abandoned. So, around 3.8 million UK taxpayers were excluded from meaningful financial support during the pandemic. That figure is supported by analysis from HMRC, the National Audit Office, and research cited by the House of Commons Library. They included company directors paid through dividends, newly self-employed people, new businesses, PAYE freelancers, new starters, and those whose circumstances such as maternity, adoption or parental leave, or those on carers allowance, placed them just outside rigid eligibility rules. This was a substantial part of the British workforce. These government support schemes work well for many, but excluded millions by design. The problem was not the absence of data, but the choice made about how that data would be used. Company directors paid through dividends were told that their income could not be verified despite submitting annual self-assessments, corporation tax returns and company accounts to Companies House. New businesses were excluded simply because they had not traded for long enough. Mixed income workers were penalized for having diversified their earnings. These people were not invisible to the tax system, they were invisible to the support schemes. The decision to exclude them was not an administrative necessity, it was a policy decision, and for that alone, the 3.8 million people left out must have an apology. These decisions are now rightly being examined by the UK Covid-19 inquiry. Module 9, which focuses on the economic response, is considering how eligibility criteria were set, how fraud risk was assessed, and how trades-off were made between speed and fairness. And that scrutiny is essential because the consequences of exclusion were not abstract. They were human, financial, and in many cases long-lasting. The inquiry must not simply catalogue what happened, but confront what it meant for those left outside the system. Yes, I will.
Thank you. A 2021 University of Bristol report said that the women in their 40s with dependent children were disproportionately represented among the excluded, which raises concerns about child poverty, mental ill health and compounding the effects of the gender pay gap. Does my honourable friend agree that research is needed into these and other longer-term impacts so they can be addressed?
Absolutely, I fully agree with my honourable friend, and in fact this is one of our asks as well, so that we not make the same mistake again. My constituent Victoria, who is in the gallery today, ran an events business, hosting exhibitions and award ceremonies, and was ineligible for any scheme. A bounce-back loan was taken out simply to survive, and 5 years on, the debt remains, the recovery never fully came, and the business is now closing. Another constituent of mine moved roles, and he was informed that he would not be furloughed by his new employer as the cut-off for furlough through payroll had passed. There was very little consideration for people in their position. Another constituent was a director of a small education consultancy. They were told that income as dividends could not be distinguished from unearned income, despite verified accounts and professional oversight. The effect of that decision did not end when lockdowns lifted. The financial impact of exclusion was severe, but the human cost was greater still. Campaign groups have documented widespread mental distress across those excluded from support, including cases of suicide linked to financial hardship during the pandemic. There were people who felt hopeless, abandoned, and unseen. The mental health consequences of exclusion are still being felt, and they should weigh heavily on this House. The excluded have three requests of this government: an apology to the nearly 4 million workers who were abandoned, parity of support, and an acknowledgement of loss of earnings and consequential loss. And I asked the Minister to come and meet with the APPG on gaps in COVID-19 financial support so that he can hear directly from those affected. At the same time as millions of taxpayers were excluded from support, vast sums of public money were spent on dodgy PPE. The National Audit Office has confirmed that billions were lost through error and fraud across COVID-19 schemes. The PPE MedPro case illustrates this imbalance starkly. A company fast-tracked through the government VIP lane was paid 122 million for surgical gowns later ruled unfit for use, and has since been ordered to repay 148 million to the public purse. Therefore, this debate is not just about reflecting on what went wrong in the past. It is about recognizing and acknowledging the injustice, starting with an apology to the nearly 4 million workers who were abandoned under the previous Conservative government. We also must prepare properly for the future. Public health experts have been clear that future pandemics and national emergencies are not a question of if, but when. When that moment comes, this House has a responsibility to ensure that no one slips through the gaps again. Emergency support schemes must be designed around the reality of how people work in this country. Millions of people do not fit neatly into a single employment category. They combine PAYE work with self-employment, run small limited companies, take time out for caring responsibilities, or build new businesses from scratch. That diversity is a strength of our economy, not a problem to be designed out of eligibility. The state already holds a vast amount of information through HMRC, Companies House, and other bodies. The lesson of COVID is that the issue was not a lack of data, but a lack of willingness to use it flexibly and fairly. Of course I will.
Thank you. I worked in health and social care during the COVID pandemic, and so I didn't experience furlough. In fact, we worked very, very hard indeed. Some of these self-employed people that were excluded that you're referencing, I mean, they are still suffering today. Does she agree with me that they are paying the price of the sheer incompetence of the previous government in how it managed that process?
I thank the honourable member for making that point. Yes, I fully agree with him, and I hope that the new Labour government will actually reflect on what went on and engage with all those that were excluded. So I look forward to the response from the Minister on this. So next time, inclusion must be the starting point and not an afterthought. But preparing for the future is not only about better scheme design. It is also about restoring trust in how public money is handled. During the pandemic, many legitimate taxpayers were denied support on the grounds of fraud risk, while at the same time, vast sums of public money were lost through waste, error, and contracts awarded through so-called VIP lanes. The PPE MedPro case raises serious questions about how decisions were taken and who benefited from them. While hard-working families and small businesses were pushed into debt and hardship, those connected to questionable contracts were fast-tracked and rewarded. Huge sums were handed out with little scrutiny, and in some cases, for equipment that put our brave doctors and nurses at risk, that could not even be used or ended up incinerated. And that imbalance matters because it corrodes trust. If we fail to learn these lessons, then we fail the very people who kept paying in even when they were left out. And if we succeed, then future emergency support can be fast, fair, and trusted. And this is what those who were excluded deserve. And that is what this House should commit to delivering. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, I have in the region of 10 members wanting to speak. So if they would restrict themselves to about 5 minutes each, I'll probably get everybody in. Steve Witherden.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I also thank my friend, the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon, for securing this incredibly important and long overdue debate, and also for being such a strong voice for those excluded from COVID-19 financial support. The Gaps in COVID-19 Financial Support APPG, of which I chair, currently has 77 cross-party members, demonstrating the strength of feeling across the House and desire to represent constituents affected by this issue. We have just heard a powerful case for the acknowledgement that approximately 3.8 million people were wholly or partially excluded from meaningful COVID-19 financial support. Years on, many remain burdened by unimaginable debt, some disgusting smears, declining mental health, and the loss of homes, businesses and livelihoods. I was an advocate for some of these underrepresented people in my previous role as the NASWT National Executive Member for the 6 counties of North Wales. Supply teachers with no contracted hours at all and no guaranteed work from day to day, even before the pandemic, were placed in a terrible position. In 4 of the North Wales counties I represented, a furlough-type payment was arranged. In 2, Gwynedd and Ynys Môn, a furlough payment was not arranged. This cohort of workers went through incredibly difficult times. In any capacity, professional or otherwise, when you speak with people who can't pay their rent or are in mortgage arrears, or where you can hear over the phone young, hungry children crying in the background, it leaves a deep and lasting impression on you. During the run-up to the 2024 general election, I met with campaigners for Excluded UK and learned that this situation was far bigger than supply teachers in 2 counties in North West Wales, and that it affected millions of people across the country and in many different industries. One of these campaigners was Ken, a small business owner and now constituent of mine. He remembers the Right Honourable Member for Richmond and Northallerton promising to the nation that no one would be left behind, and then the shock of finding himself with no support. Not only was he left without support for day-to-day living, but he also had to shoulder the ongoing costs of keeping a business afloat. The pandemic brought much to a halt, but software licences, professional fees and other essential overheads did not stop. Ken began working at 17 and is now 72. He describes this as the only time when he needed help. The help was not there. That feeling has stayed with him ever since, not only because of the toll on his mental health, but because of the monthly reminder when he has to repay the bounce-back loan he was forced to take out to survive the pandemic. And Ken's story is just one of many still suffering from the after-effects of being excluded. 40 known suicides have been directly linked to exclusion from Covid-19 financial support. Hundreds more have attempted suicide, alongside widespread clinical anxiety, depression and trauma. These figures relate only to individuals known within the excluded UK membership and are likely to represent only a fraction of the true number. So I asked the Minister, will he acknowledge that the exclusion of around 3.8 million taxpayers from meaningful Covid-19 financial support was a serious policy failure? Will the government publish an assessment of the continuing financial and psychological harm, including suicide risk, and set out the support pathway for affected people? And finally, what steps is he taking to ensure future crisis support will be inclusive, with stronger parliamentary oversight? I wish to put on record my personal thanks to Jennifer Griffiths, Head Member of Welfare at Excluded UK and Secretariat of the APPG. She is the backbone of this campaign, and without her tireless work, many more lives would have been lost. And also to Tim Pravda for his long-standing advocacy and indispensable voice in this ongoing fight for justice. I would appreciate it if the Minister would agree to meet with the APPG, the Excluded UK and bereaved families of those who died by suicide linked to exclusion. Diolch yn fawr.
Esther McVey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon for bringing forward this debate today, and to the Backbench Business Committee for granting it. There is no doubt that the hardship affecting families, businesses and communities as a result of COVID-19 policies is ongoing. And the depth of suffering is frankly hard to read about. People pushed to their limits mentally and financially, having to endure indignity and injustice through no fault of their own. I do hope we can now all agree that it should never have happened, and it is something that we never want to see happen again. The various government financial support schemes that were set up did help many people, but for the forgotten businesses and individuals for who one bureaucratic reason or another were deemed ineligible, the situation was patently unfair and unjust. That's 3.8 million UK taxpayers who were excluded from support, while the rest of the working population were paid to stay at home. And why were they excluded? The reasons were arbitrary. Financial support was not forthcoming if a person was newly self-employed, or a PAYE freelancer, or a director paid in dividends, or someone starting a new job. The list went on. The rules were random, confusing, and pushed so many into desperate situations. Sadly, we shouldn't have been surprised that this happened. While some marvelled at the speedy rollout of the government's schemes, the reality was that the schemes were patchy, poorly thought out and full of gaps. Of course they were. How could we ever expect to shut down our society and our economy and be able to cover the gigantic financial cost of that, while making sure every person was properly looked after? It was unrealistic, and it was an unprecedented state intervention that was doomed to fail. I totally agree with those here today pushing for assurances that this will never happen again. But if we can't look back with honesty and clarity on what was done, then we are doomed to make the same mistakes again. Lockdown was the mistake from which all these injustices and suffering flowed. It was an unknown and unevidenced imposition that should never have been inflicted upon the British people. Many experts predicted from the start that they would cause untold misery and horrifically cost hundreds of thousands of lives through the unintended but very real collateral damage. It was a policy... I will indeed give way.
I thank my honourable friend Fink for giving way and for her powerful speech. Would she agree with me, so we may differ on the opinion about lockdown, but would she agree with me that had we not gone into lockdown, many more thousands of people would have lost their lives?
I don't believe the evidence proves that. I think we can look to other parts of the world and that wasn't the case. It was a policy that had unwavering and enthusiastic support from all sides of the House, with just a few of us, too few of us in this House, raising valid concerns, but were shut down. It should be obvious that some people can't be damaged in the name of protecting others with interventions such as lockdowns that we don't know even if they work. The moral mathematics never added up. And now we must live with the consequences of what we did. We spent the region of 400 billion on COVID-19 response, a vast sum that will be clawed back through increased taxation and hardship for generations to come. And of course the Conservative Party had to put up taxes, but it was voted by every member pretty much in the House here, so taxes went up to pay for that £400 billion. And for me, such a statist intervention, such a socialist intervention would never work, and so it's proving to be. So for those businesses who did manage to survive, after everything that was thrown at them in the name of COVID, well, now they're having to face more gloom and doom from this socialist government in charge of our country that is pushing up taxes with two tax-busting budgets and also removing, without understanding it, business rates so far.
Order. The subject of the debate is financial support, specifically for COVID, and the Honourable Lady might want to make sure that she stays within the scope of that.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. That was a sentence I was adding on because I felt it was very relevant that those who did manage to survive now aren't because of the extra taxes that are being put upon them. Plus, as business relief, which was part of COVID, is now being removed, and it seemed that the Chancellor didn't even know how that worked. So actually, they are suffering twofold because only some of that COVID benefit is now being removed. No wonder Labour MPs are being banned from pubs at the moment as we see mass closures of pubs going forward. So in conclusion, I will simply ask that we examine the bigger picture. Those 3.8 million people who were excluded from financial support and suffered a terrible injustice. But so too did those that received support, because lockdown took from everyone. Children denied education, mothers forced to give birth alone, people suffering heart attacks, strokes, sepsis, but too frightened to burden the NHS, bereaved families unable to mourn the dead. The list of injustices go on and on. None of it should ever have happened. The costs were always going to be too high, and worse, there appears to be no evidence that lockdown prevented those infections. And the COVID inquiry recently made two incredible assertions. One was that lockdowns were harmful, but should have started earlier, and the other was that the modelling should not have been used to justify major policy, but simultaneously prove that 23,000 lives could have been saved. So finally, lockdown was, as Professor Sunatra Gupta from the University of Oxford said...
Order. The debate is not about lockdown. It is about financial support. I hope the Honourable Lady is concluding her remarks.
I am concluding my remarks, and I'm pleased to have been able to speak today of one of a handful out of 650 MPs who stood by the Forgotten Limited, who stood by many of our constituents whose businesses went out of business, as I was one of the few in the House, like I said, a handful who stood up for those people and the Forgotten Limited. So finally, as Professor Sunatra Gupta said, this was like taking a hammer to a fly on a pane of glass. And this is a quote: "You might or might not kill the fly, but you definitely shatter the window. It will take us a long time to pick up all those pieces. Next time we face a similar crisis, let's not panic and reach for the hammer."
Jayne Kirkham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the member for Stratford-upon-Avon for securing a debate on this really important subject. For many people, the Covid-19 pandemic was an incredibly difficult time. Healthcare and other key workers who serve their communities courageously, people who contracted the virus and their loved ones, children and young people who missed out on education and social interaction, and for anyone who had to isolate alone. It was also an immensely stressful time for people who lost their incomes but couldn't get financial support. As we've heard from other members, this group included many different types of people. I would like to share with the House examples of two of my constituents who faced financial repercussions as a result of the Covid-19 pandemic. One of my constituents was a journalist and table tennis coach when the UK went into lockdown in March 2020. She was unable to do either of those jobs but received no government support as she was deemed a fraud risk because her earned income was less than her combined state pension and work pension. She feels she was abandoned by those who should have had some empathy for the small business entrepreneurs whose lives were so badly affected by lockdown. Another of my constituents is a business owner who entered insolvency due to the pandemic through no fault of his own. My constituent had to close his worldwide travel risk management business during the pandemic due to the restrictions in place at the time. Despite having run a viable business before COVID, he now finds himself subject to extremely high interest rates, up to 32% on loans he's trying to secure to set himself back up in business. He's concerned he's being penalised as though his insolvency was the result of mismanagement or poor creditworthiness, rather than extraordinary and unforeseeable external circumstances. This not only hinders recovery efforts, but may also discourage future entrepreneurship. I would be grateful if the Minister would address the experiences of both my constituents and how the government can recognise the financial hardship that many taxpayers across the UK suffered during the Covid-19 lockdowns and ensure this would never happen in the future.
Charlotte Kane.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-on-Avon, for bringing this debate, and I thank the Backbench Committee for making time for it. As we approach the 6-year anniversary of the very first lockdown, I'm sure many colleagues will agree the time of face masks, social distancing and self-isolation feels so very long ago. However, for millions of individuals and countless businesses, it has been an even more arduous 6 years. Research now suggests, as we've heard, that about 3.8 million UK taxpayers were excluded from any support, and they did not enjoy the security that so many of the rest of us did. As we reflect on the ongoing fallout of the pandemic, it's vital that we take on the lessons learnt. But the matter of groups excluded from financial support during the pandemic isn't one we've only learnt in retrospect. There are issues which were raised at the time, in real time, and the failure to listen and act is one which any government must recognise and make efforts to rectify. We all understand why the initial schemes were targeted to support the majority of people, employees and established self-employed, but we waited in vain for the then Conservative government to provide support schemes for the other 3.8 million people. One outstanding issue, as we've heard, was the unnecessarily rigid criteria for the self-employed income support scheme. The glaring issue here was the exclusion of the recently self-employed, as you had to have a tax return for the year 2018-19. This, combined with the 50% rule, which people have talked about, prevented many people from getting any help as well. And we've heard too about the women who may have kept their businesses ticking over for a few years while they were on a maternity break or caring for someone, and they found their support based on a low-income year rather than the more representative years. Similarly, many small businesses were forced to take out bounce-back loans. The government has already estimated that many of these loans will not be recoverable because many businesses were forced to close. Yet those that have clung on are still working to pay the loans off, all whilst working in an environment of spiralling energy costs and a business rate system which still doesn't work properly. I visited one such business in my constituency only last week. To manage their current costs, they've reduced staff and taken on more of the work themselves. They've run through the figures for next year, and the expected rise in business rates plus their COVID loan repayments means they're having to consider selling up or closing the business. Sorry? Oh, yes, I will give way.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. Whilst there were many small businesses in my constituency that were actually grateful for the support they received, their main concern, which many of them kept repeating to me actually, was regarding the abrupt end to the support measures. Almost overnight, small businesses found themselves having to repay loans, cover staff wages and all these other expenses, even though the economy hadn't bounced back and their sales hadn't returned to pre-COVID levels. Does the Honourable Lady agree with me that we need to ensure that in the event of a future crisis, as well as not excluding those that need it, we have to support measures that make sure that anything that's given to people to help them through this period of time doesn't end with a cliff edge, but is tapered to allow to adjust for a post-crisis system?
I thank the Honourable Member. I do agree it's really important that when we set up something to deal with the initial crisis, we don't take it away too quickly when the crisis itself is over, but the economy, as you say, still hasn't bounced back. After facing the turmoil of the pandemic, small businesses, many of whose directors were also unable to claim financial support, have been afforded little in way of meaningful relief, all while barely affording to cover their costs. But these small businesses contribute so much to our local economies, and they're also to our communities as much valued hubs. And I see this time and again in the towns and villages across my constituency. I want to talk about one of my constituents who suffered particularly badly. He ran a specialist travel business, which inevitably the income collapsed during COVID. He got no support. He was actually told by a local Conservative that they saw, quote, no point in supporting those whose jobs won't exist. He had hope because Labour in opposition criticised the Conservatives' lack of support for the 3.8 million. But now he feels, in his own words, disheartened and abandoned in what he describes as the tumbleweed since Labour came to power. Through determination and hard work, he has rebuilt his business, but he wants to ensure that future self-employed generations don't suffer what he calls the same nightmare. Madam Deputy Speaker, the pandemic has done deep and lasting damage, but we must recognise that simply learning a lesson doesn't go far enough. It's not too late for the government to fill the gaps in the pandemic financial support, relieve businesses of their burdens, and provide meaningful support to those often financially vulnerable people who missed out unnecessarily. Will the Minister now recognise that COVID-19 financial relief failed to provide fair and even support and take steps to ease the ongoing burdens faced as a result?
Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon for securing this really important debate. When the COVID-19 pandemic unfolded, it tested every part of our society. It pushed our health system, our communities and our economy to the brink. And in that moment of crisis, emergency financial support was rightly created at unprecedented speed. These measures protected millions, but despite the scale of that effort, far too many people were left behind. The Excluded UK campaign emerged because an estimated 3.8 million individuals fell through the gaps in pandemic financial support. These were freelancers, newly self-employed people, small business owners, PAYE short-term contractors and others whose circumstances simply didn't fit the rigid eligibility rules. They were contributing members of society who paid taxes, built businesses and supported local economies, yet at the moment they needed help most, many found none. These included constituents in mid-Cheshire, many of whom have contacted me ahead of this debate, people who'd done everything asked of them, built livelihoods, paid their taxes and still found themselves excluded from support when the pandemic hit, people who saw their livelihoods disappear overnight, people forced to drain life savings, sell belongings or take on unsustainable debt just to survive, people who felt unheard, unseen and unvalued by the systems meant to protect them, and tragically for some, the emotional and financial devastation became unbearable. Each of those lives lost is a reminder that policy decisions are not abstract. They reach deeply into homes, families and futures. But we must not only recognise and acknowledge the impact that exclusion had on these individuals, but also showed renewed determination to ensure that such gaps never re-emerge. The pandemic has taught us something essential. Economic resilience is public health resilience. There can be no effective emergency response if large groups of people are left without support. A society is only as strong as its most vulnerable moment. And as the UK continues to develop its preparedness planning for future pandemics and national emergencies, it is vital that support systems are designed with the flexibility to meet people where they actually are, not where policy assumes them to be. And that means ensuring that any future emergency financial support schemes are properly stress tested in advance against real-world employment patterns, so that they reflect the diversity of modern working lives before they are ever deployed. No one contributing to the economy should face a crisis without a lifeline. And mental health impacts must be treated as a central component of emergency planning, not an afterthought. Just as importantly, the voices of those previously excluded should be included in future policy discussions so that lived experience shapes the solutions of tomorrow. Preparedness must mean more than storing equipment or writing contingency documents. It must mean designing a compassionate, comprehensive safety net, one that recognises the full spectrum of working lives in the UK and ensures that the mistakes of the past are not repeated.
On that point, will my honourable friend give way? I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Covid-19 clearly had an enormous impact on the economy of the world and the UK. And in terms of preparing ourselves for any future threat under those circumstances, would he agree with me that the fraud and corruption that was facilitated by the previous government was an absolute disgrace, and that it is up to this Labour government to get our money back and solve those problems?
Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I think the Chancellor of the Exchequer has done exactly the right thing by setting up the COVID Corruption Commissioner. There were those who, during the pandemic, didn't see it as a moment of national emergency where we should all get together. They saw it as an opportunity to line their own pockets. The Chancellor is doing exactly the right thing by trying to root out those people and make sure that they suffer the consequences. I thank him for his intervention. We can't change what happened, but we can choose what happens next. Let us learn the lessons from past schemes that left too many people excluded. Let us move forward by building systems that protect everyone, and let us ensure that in any future crisis, we never again leave millions to face hardship alone. Therefore, I ask the Minister, what specific steps will the government take to ensure that any future emergency financial support schemes are designed with the flexibility, fairness and real-world applicability needed to prevent millions from ever again being excluded in their moment of greatest need? Thank you.
And now with a formal 4-minute time limit, Paul Kohler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I congratulate the member for Stratford-on-Avon for securing this important debate. During the pandemic, the state quite rightly intervened on an unprecedented scale. Hospitality businesses received grants, employees were furloughed and billions were distributed through schemes that were fast, generous and non-repayable. Yet alongside that, there exists a shadow group that did not fit into neat categories. new starters, new businesses, PAYE freelancers, many directors of limited companies and numerous other groups, as we've heard. Millions of people saw their work vanish overnight. Their income collapsed and were told bluntly when they applied for help, the computer says no. Meanwhile, the Conservative government's handling of PPE contracts left taxpayers out of pocket to the tunes of billions. An interim government report found that defective PPE contracts cost the British taxpayer at least £1.4 billion. VIP lanes and fast-track deals with Tory friends and supporters led to waste, inefficiency and fraud. This was money that could have kept millions of small businesses and self-employed people afloat, yet was instead mismanaged at the hands of well-connected insiders. The vast majority of those excluded earned under £50,000 per year before the pandemic, working in trades, retail, education, the creative industries, hospitality and events. They were economically active, often running micro-businesses and that supported local jobs and sustained vital supply chains. As we've heard, 3.8 million people were excluded, roughly 1 in 10 of the UK workforce. While their neighbours received thousands of pounds to stay afloat, they were left with nothing. As a cabaret bar owner, I saw myself what that meant in practice. My freelance artists, the musicians, the singers, the burlesque dancers, the drag queens, as self-employed performers received no help from the state. And years later, many are still living with the debts that did not end when the lockdowns did. For those who are excluded, be they freelancers, sole traders or small businesses, survival often meant borrowing through bounce-back loans, credit cards, overdrafts and personal loans. Many are still repaying those loans today, at a time when rising energy prices, inflation, supply chain pressures and the cost of living crisis makes every repayment a struggle. And what makes this hard to accept is that the exclusion was not inevitable. Treasury-ready solutions existed. Excluded UK analysis shows the fully costed, low-fraud proposals based on HMRC data could have reached the vast majority of those excluded. These solutions had backing from across the political spectrum, were supported by business groups and experts, yet ministers in the Conservative government chose not to act. Unlike the Northern Ireland Executive, who worked with HMRC to deliver targeted grants to newly self-employed people and limited company directors who were excluded from UK-wide schemes. So, if it could be done in Northern Ireland, why not in the rest of the UK? The government is rightly pursuing the fraudsters where money was wrongly paid out, but it cannot ignore the money that was wrongly withheld. The recently published final report by the COVID Counter-Fraud Commissioner makes clear that weakness in preparedness, data sharing and oversight was the very reason millions were excluded. It's incumbent upon this House to acknowledge that those who were excluded were wronged. It's a serious policy failure with lasting consequences. Furthermore, we must address the legacy. That means looking seriously at debt relief or redress for those forced into borrowing to survive. It means learning from what worked in Northern Ireland. It means ensuring that in any future crisis, support is inclusive by default, so that no group of taxpayers is ever again told the computer says no. Thank you.
Euan Stainbank.
Deputy Speaker, in the early days of the pandemic, the country came together in the worst of times, making unprecedented sacrifices to all of our lives so that we could collectively fight the pandemic and save lives. It also put the structure of governance and our public finances under extreme strain. There were undoubtedly difficult, sometimes impossible choices that had to be made, such as the responsibility of government. But as the Covid inquiry and many of our constituents have told us, there were people who were failed. Financially, individuals and small businesses in my constituency, and as we've heard powerfully across the country, found themselves excluded from support as their lives did not map cleanly onto the fantasy of seamless transition from workplace to workplace, from business to business. They were told their circumstances meant they did not qualify. New businesses, the newly self-employed, freelancers, those on parental leave, and I've heard from company directors, as several members have mentioned, from small businesses who receive their income from dividends and a salary, to name just a few, as has been powerfully put, especially from my honourable friend from Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr. Those also in the most precarious employment were hit the hardest, with job opportunities limited, and we saw youth unemployment spike during the pandemic from 12.4% immediately before the lockdown to 15.2% only 4 months later. Many of whom were made unemployed because of the high turnover and insecure nature of their workplaces, and they were not on the payroll when it came round to the 19th of March 2020. Just before the first lockdown, I, alongside many students were working under 0 hours contracts seasonally in the hospitality sector, taking time off during March and February to complete the honours levels of our degrees. We expected to return that summer to work alongside pursuing our careers, but we were not given any support during that pandemic, found our employment opportunities limited and no furlough available. There was no restitution for the loss of income and opportunity many young people faced during the pandemic. The impact felt by the generation most likely to be employed in these casualised or ad hoc employments were set back. Plans to move out of home, pay off their student loans, begin a career. The proof points of a successful journey through our economy were delayed, and for many, survival became the predominant need to desperately pay their bills, feed their kids, or survive through any means possible. Although the pandemic was hopefully a once-in-a-lifetime event, this government must be prepared for any such eventuality, and it's a good reminder of the harm of balancing the labour market in one direction. One constituent who got in touch with me regarding this was a company director that was paid within dividends and a small salary, received no support because of this gap. They pointed out that not only was the lack of support hugely challenging, but colleagues and competitors with a clearer definition of self-employment within the same industry did receive support and were provided with a significant competitive advantage which continues to this day. This is harmful to the economy, it is an injustice to my constituent and limited company directors like him. People years later feel as if they are still trying to tread water with a weight chained to their ankle as they maintain businesses whilst paying back extensive loans to bridge the pandemic's severe impact on their business. I commend the very good work the government have done to identify the clear waste and instances of fraud that occurred during COVID. The COVID Corruption Commissioner identified £10.9 billion in losses due to weak accountability, bad quality data and poor contracting from the previous government. But we can go further, and I would welcome an acknowledgement from the Minister that better design from the schemes from the previous government could have averted these losses, and that should and could have been spent on deploying support that would unchain many people, including my constituent, from the extensive, consequential and at the time impacts they went through. This should be recognised also through a clear and unambiguous statement of support for those impacted by delivering an apology on behalf of the British state. I commend the campaigners that excluded the UK and their supporters who've been relentless in advocating 6 years on from almost 6 years on from the start of the pandemic, fighting every day, chained financially to the circumstances caused by the pandemic, but
Order. Iqbal Mohamed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I refer the members to my register of interest. I thank my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-on-Avon, for securing this important debate. The COVID pandemic was an unprecedented crisis that placed immense strain on ruling parties worldwide. Few, if any, could dispute that rapid, decisive intervention was necessary to prevent an utterly catastrophic collapse in the British economy. But acknowledging the scale of the challenge does not absolve the government of responsibility for how that money was spent, or how its support schemes were designed and implemented, or how recklessly public funds were safeguarded. While some degree of waste and fraud is inevitable in a crisis, the scale of loss during the pandemic was not inevitable, but the result of systemic failure within the UK government, a failure that remains unchecked under the current Labour administration. The Office for Budget Responsibility estimates that COVID support measures total somewhere between £169 to £192 billion. This included a variety of schemes from furloughing individuals to protect them from unemployment to grants and loans intended to help businesses stay solvent. Yet, for nearly 3.8 million freelancers and self-employed workers, the support system simply did not work. Many were excluded altogether from financial assistance through rigid eligibility criteria, outdated data, or blunt distinction drawn between modern forms of work. That said, much of the COVID-19 spending to those whom it was available to did undoubtedly save jobs and prevent mass insolvency. Government departments and public bodies were forced into reactive policy making, scrambling to design schemes in real time, often without effective oversight or proper safeguards against abuse. Nowhere was this more evident than in the scale of fraud committed against the government support schemes. According to the Independent COVID Counter-Fraud Commissioner's final report published last month, £10.9 billion of taxpayer money was lost to fraud and error across COVID support schemes. Of that sum, only £1.8 billion so far has been recovered. The remainder, as the report makes clear, is likely beyond recovery, with fraud prevention efforts identified as falling short across government. The causes of this failure are well documented in the aforementioned report, but one particular point that stuck out to me was that banks were instructed to suspend their usual due diligence despite voicing explicit warnings about heightened risks of fraud. Better design was possible. Britain appears to stand alone in the G7 with respect to the scale of fraud experienced during COVID. Other countries managed to move quickly while still embedding stronger checks. The lesson is not that speed and scrutiny are incompatible, but that the government of the time chose not to prioritise the latter. That so few consequences have followed these failures only deepens public cynicism with democratic political processes. Keir Starmer was elected on a platform.
We don't refer to the Prime Minister by his name, but as the Prime Minister. Iqbal Mohamed.
Apologies, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister was elected on a platform that pledged to clean up politics and crack down on those who defraud the public purse. Yet introducing stiffer penalties for individuals and corporations that are illegally profiteering from a crisis, that government is spearheading punitive legislation on alleged welfare fraud checks and criminalising innocent benefit claimants. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, what unites all of what I've spoken about and members across the House? Fraud, waste, cronyism is a failure of governance, a failure to adequately plan and properly design systems to protect the public purse. If we are serious about restoring trust in politics...
Order. Olly Glover.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and can I thank my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-on-Avon, for a very passionate speech and for moving this topic, and to the Backbench Business Committee for giving time to this topic. And as many honourable members have said, COVID feels like a distant memory to so many of us, but continues to have severe, long-lasting effects, including those we are discussing today. And I would like to talk about a couple of constituents who have been affected by the COVID-19 financial support exclusion issue. Fiona and her husband, Bill Bruty, ran a training and consultancy business called Fundraising Training Business from their bedroom, which helps charities both here and abroad to raise money by running training courses. And they are affected by the issue of no financial support given to business owners whose income principally derived from dividends. Whilst they eventually received £2,000 from South Oxford District Council, they went through tremendous stress and financial struggles. And in their words, nobody has understood what happened and the mental anguish it caused so many of us who had paid taxes and did not have business premises. Now, for them, face-to-face training has never recovered from the pandemic. And Bill's had to suddenly put everything online, which ultimately has been good for them as they have learnt to adapt in our new increasingly online lives. But that is an effect that we have seen in many other smaller businesses. Now, Rob is a limited company director who felt that he and other limited company directors were badly treated as it was deemed too hard for HMRC to check where dividends came from. And also, limited company employees were denied the right to earn income from other sources. Now, in terms of where we go from here, I think, firstly, it would be interesting to hear from the Minister what redress he thinks should be considered, given the campaign that Excluded UK has been mounted. Secondly, it is important we learn for the future. Now, of course, we all hope that scientists are wrong, but many scientists fear that another pandemic is only a matter of time for a variety of factors. And indeed, there may be other forms of economic hardship, which means we will need to consider these matters again and come up with better processes in future. But I think it also points to a wider point that perhaps government and politics in this country has been more focused on larger companies rather than those who run their own businesses and are self-employed. And that's something that in this House I think we should all think about. And that's why the concerns that small businesses have been raising with me in more recent times, many of whom also suffered during the pandemic, are a big concern in terms of the impact on them of current decisions on business rates or alcohol duty. and other taxation policies like that. I'm proud that the Liberal Democrats were one of the first parties to call for support for self-employed people during the pandemic, and we secured an urgent question on this topic on the 24th of March 2025. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is so important that we recognise the contributions that small businesses and the self-employed make to our economy. So as well as learning the lessons from the pandemic, we really need to think how we support them so that they are better prepared in case of a future economic disaster, such as the one that we all lived through in 2020 to 2022.
Susan Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend from Stratford-on-Avon for bringing this important debate. The Covid-19 pandemic is undoubtedly one of the most impactful and damaging events to unfold in our lifetime. Being told to stay inside, unable to see loved ones, uncertain about the future, was incredibly difficult for everyone. Thankfully, for most, this is now a time that is just a memory, one that we would rather forget, but something that we can put behind us and move forward. Sadly, as we're hearing, though, for many people, this is something that they can't move past. Across the country, there are people who have lost businesses, lost their homes, and in the worst cases, lost loved ones to the financial stress that the pandemic caused. To add to this distress, the hard-working British people who fell through the gaps have had to watch on as numerous instances of fraud and PPE procurement mismanagement have come to light. Billions of pounds wasted and lost, which, if managed properly, could have saved people's livelihoods. Within my own constituency of Mid-Dunbartonshire, we have seen local businesses close. One constituent who still feels the impact in particular has told me that a complete lack of support forced his takeaway business, which he had built up from scratch, to shut. Yet when he tried to move on, they found that they were at a disadvantage. And despite holding a personal taxi driver's licence, they were having to rent a taxi plate at a cost of more than £400 a week. The absence of meaningful support during COVID didn't just cost them their business at the time, it continues to have a direct and measurable impact on their ability to rebuild their livelihood today. But my constituency is just one of the nearly 4 million people impacted by this. These people deserve support, they deserve acknowledgement of the loss they suffered, and they deserve an apology. Beyond this, though, we need to listen to the voices of those who have been affected and learn from their experience so that we can find the gaps in our system that people have fallen through and plug them. As the world becomes more unstable, we need to make sure that at home, people and businesses have security. If we are serious about building resilience as a country, we can't simply move on and hope that those who were left behind will do the same. We must recognise the harm that has been done. We must be honest about the failures that allowed people to fall through the cracks, and we must take steps to fix them in future. Thank you.
Which brings us to the front bench contributions. Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I begin by thanking my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-upon-Avon, for her work in securing this debate, for her excellent opening speech, and of course to the Backbench Business Committee for giving us time to debate this important topic. Small businesses and self-employed people played a vital role in sustaining communities throughout the challenges of the Covid-19 pandemic, often at significant personal and financial cost. The pandemic placed unprecedented pressure on people, affecting the livelihoods of millions from all walks of life. There were additional concerns for those self-employed people and small business owners who faced that even greater level of uncertainty experienced by the lack of support from the then Tory government. The Liberal Democrats have stood by them from the get-go. We were the first party to call for support for self-employed people during the pandemic, and we helped to secure that self-employed support scheme. The COVID pandemic had a devastating impact on people across the country. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives, and we must never forget the tragedies of that pandemic. People lost mothers, fathers, grandparents, siblings, friends, husbands, wives. People were left isolated, unable to see others for weeks on end, and unable to visit sick relatives, attend the wedding of a loved one, or hug their families at funerals. And possibly as a measure of how much Time has passed since that time, and how much has changed. I think there are only a minority of those of us in the chamber today who are actually members of Parliament during that pandemic, of which I think I'm the only Liberal Democrat. But like many who were sitting MPs during that pandemic, I received such heartbreaking correspondence from my constituents, and their struggles will stay with me, and I will remember their suffering for as long as I continue to represent my constituency. So I reflect with gratitude on the bravery of doctors, nurses and carers who did everything they could, often working incredible hours to save lives and to support those around them, often putting themselves at risk to do so, and the thousands of people who selflessly help their communities, whether it's as vaccinators, picking up prescriptions, shopping for elderly and vulnerable neighbours, and we mustn't forget those who suffered and those who made sacrifices to ensure that suffering was limited as much as possible. The strong sense of public service and neighbourliness shown by people across the country was not reflected by the government of the day. The COVID inquiry has confirmed there were systematic and political failings which worsened people's suffering. A lack of scrutiny, a lack of accountability led to the wrong decisions, often with catastrophic results. From the lack of preparedness for a pandemic to the failure to protect those in care homes, the cruelty and inflexibility of the isolation that people endured in the most desperate circumstances, including on their deathbeds, and most shockingly of all, Partygate. And we must ensure that there can never again be such suffering or such lack of preparedness. I think it's particularly important that the government continues to recognise the contribution made by small businesses and the self-employed during the COVID pandemic, and the government should ensure that it has learned the lessons of that period and keep under review its long-term impacts, and ensuring that people and businesses can leave behind that series of economic challenges that began with the pandemic, including the energy crisis, the rising cost of living, the growing tax burden, and remain resilient, is essential to our long-term economic and social well-being. The government needs to do more to recognise the value of the self-employed, contractors, small businesses to our economy. And there's so much more that they could be doing now to support them and to show the value that they contribute, the flexible working, the specialist expertise and the range of ways that having contractors, self-employed and small businesses can help to support the broader economy. And we need to do much more now to recognise that value. Liberal Democrats are calling for greater transparency and support for the self-employed in making tax digital, for example, originally intended to simplify the tax system, but has created new burdens, cost and confusion. We must make sure that the self-employed are properly informed and supported through this particular reform. The Liberal Democrats have strongly supported the expansion of workers' rights during the passage of the Employment Rights Bill. We've pushed for some of those benefits to be extended to
Order. I appreciate that the Honourable Lady is referring to self-employed and small businesses who were impacted by COVID-19 financial support, but I'm not convinced that making tax digital and the Employment Rights Bill fall within the scope of this debate. Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wanted to reflect the value of the self-employed to our economy now, and merely to reflect on the fact that as we learn the lessons from COVID, we think about how that group of workers can be supported more broadly. And I think that is a pressing issue for now, but I accept that we are debating what happened 6 years ago. The extremely challenging period that small businesses and self-employed people went through just a few years ago makes it even more important that the government address the major challenges they're experiencing here and now. For many of them, of course, that includes repaying the loans that they took out at that time to maintain their businesses, which, while they are facing the increased cost challenges of today, continues to be a huge burden. So I sincerely hope that the government will listen both to my honourable friend, the member for Stratford-upon-Avon, and her impassioned speech at the opening of this debate, but also think about how they can do more in the current time to support self-employed people, contractors, small businesses who contribute so much to our economy. Thank you.
Hello, Minister James Wilde.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I join in congratulating the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon for securing this important debate, and I thank Honourable Members. I think more than 10 people have spoken in this debate on behalf of their constituents and the suffering that they have experienced and continue to experience, and they set out very powerful examples. It's now almost 6 years since the first cases of COVID were recorded in the UK from 2 Chinese nationals who had travelled from Wuhan. These were, as has been said, some of the most challenging times for our nation. 230,000 people tragically died, and there's a very powerful memorial just across the river from this place that we see every day, to remind us. And lockdowns and restrictions were imposed and choices were made that no government would want to have to make. And as a newly elected MP, I was faced with voting and supporting measures which I wasn't expecting to have to do when I came into this place to restrict people's freedom. And clearly not every decision that was taken was got right. Mistakes were obviously made. They would be in a pandemic situation. But overall, this unprecedented challenge was met with unprecedented action. And on the economy, the subject of this debate, the actions taken by the then Conservative government protected millions of jobs and supported businesses and those most in need. When the pandemic struck, the government acted swiftly. The coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, which protected 11 million jobs at a cost of £70 billion, was announced on the 20th of March. That came shortly afterwards. The first lockdown was then announced. And at its peak, nearly 9 million people were on furlough, preventing widespread unemployment. For the self-employed, a topic that's been covered in most contributions, the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme was set up and delivered nearly £30 billion across 5 rounds of grants to nearly 3 million individuals. These schemes provided a lifeline to those whose livelihoods were threatened through no fault of their own. And beyond the employment support schemes, 8 grant schemes saw £23 billion paid to small businesses, administered by local authorities. And I want to pay tribute to the work that they did to put in place the systems and the mechanisms to process those payments rapidly to get the support to people who needed it. Through 3 loan schemes, nearly £80 billion worth of loans were approved, and the Bounce Back loan scheme supported 1.5 million businesses with nearly £50 billion worth of funding. It was not only loans that provided crucial support. £10 billion was made available in business rate relief to nearly 370,000 premises in the retail, hospitality and leisure sector, and we're seeing some of the consequences of unwinding the support that was put in place for them. And VAT for the hospitality sector was cut to 5%, a campaign that I and many members across the House supported to help the hospitality sector, which was particularly affected by the restrictions and some of the rules that were put in place. And this unprecedented package supported jobs and livelihoods across the UK. The government also acted to help certain groups who face particular challenges. A £20 a week uplift was put in place for people on universal credit to help those on the lowest incomes. Rules about eligibility for benefits was relaxed. And additional support for job seekers through the Kickstart and Restart schemes were also rolled out. But of course, as the Honourable Lady has said and honourable members have focused on, the support did not reach everyone. Excluded UK was established in May 2020 to represent individuals and small business owners who fell outside the main financial support schemes. As has been set out, the group estimates around 3.8 million people were unable to access full financial support despite losing their income. Those individuals included the newly self-employed, company directors paid in dividends, or those whose self-employment income was below half of their overall earnings. And I know from my time in this House, in raising these issues with ministers, the genuine hardship that my constituents in that situation faced. And many honourable members across the House at the time will attest to the many constant Teams and Zoom meetings there were with ministers, putting the position of these people, the debates that were held in this House, the reports by the Treasury Select Committee and others drawing attention to it. And the response that was consistently provided was around challenges to provide workable solutions from HMRC's systems, saying it was unable, for example, as the Honourable Member for Didcot and Wantage referred to, identifying where dividends from an individual's company came from or from other sources. And the cut-off points, the £50,000 threshold for self-employed, also led to real difficulties and unfairness. The fraud risk has been referred to by a number of honourable members, and that was one of the reasons given by the then Permanent Secretary to the Treasury as to why schemes put by the Federation of Small Businesses were cited as not being possible. There were changes through those 5 series of grants through the self-employed schemes, but frankly the restrictions created the impacts for the people who honourable members have been referring to. And the ongoing concerns raised by the campaign merit serious consideration, and that will be provided by the COVID inquiry in the module referred to by the honourable member for Stratford-on-Avon. And looking to the future, we should ensure that when the next pandemic strikes, we have better data and systems to put in place support if needed. And making tax digital may actually help in that regard, and making sure that rules do not exclude people unfairly. Equally, we must learn the lessons from the pandemic, particularly around the damaging impact of lockdowns, as my right honourable friend for Tatton has set out, in order that such huge financial firepower is not needed, because we do not put in place such restrictions. In the pandemic, the pressure for action to help people and businesses was incredibly intense. That involved trade-offs in terms of time and checks that could be implemented in support schemes. I recall vividly the clamour for support for small businesses, for example. I was part of it, and that led to the Bounce Back loan scheme with limited checks and with the consequences that has had for fraud. But that enabled lots of businesses to survive that wouldn't otherwise be here today. And the government could have spent months designing the perfect scheme while businesses collapsed and families struggled. Instead, it acted to protect the lives and livelihoods. £410 billion was spent on the COVID measures, an extraordinary sum which added greatly to our debt. But predictions by the Bank of England that unemployment would reach 9% were prevented, and unemployment peaked at 5.2% before falling back to 3.7% 2 years after the first lockdown. However, clearly, a lot of people did miss out on full financial support. And while there will continue to be a debate about the specific decisions and lessons to be learned, I think it's undoubtedly the case that our country would be in a far worse place today were it not for the decisions taken at the time. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister James Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I'd like to begin by congratulating, as others have done, the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon for securing this debate today. And I'd like to thank members from across the House for their powerful contributions. And whilst much of the debate has rightly focused on the detail of the financial support made available by the then government during the pandemic, we've also heard many deeply personal stories about businesses and individuals who are directly affected. Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2 months' time, the country will come together to mark what will be the 6th anniversary since the start of the pandemic. It will be an opportunity for us all to remember, to reflect, and to pay tribute to all those who died and whose losses are still so keenly felt in all of our constituencies. The pandemic cost over 227,000 lives in our country, and I know that the loss and grief is still felt by families whose lost ones were lost during this difficult period. Reflecting on the pandemic is, of course, as the Liberal Democrat spokesperson said, also a moment to once again express our gratitude towards all of those who worked throughout the pandemic to provide vital and, in many cases, life-saving services to all of us across the country. And, of course, reflecting on the pandemic is a moment to recommit to learning the lessons of what happened during that time so that we are better prepared for future crises. And this government is committed to learning those lessons and to doing all that we can to protect businesses and individuals across Britain in the future. Madam Deputy Speaker, as well as having a huge impact on the lives of people across the country and their families, as we've heard about today, the pandemic was, of course, a huge economic shock. GDP fell by a record 19.4%, and thousands of businesses faced closure. It was therefore necessary to support businesses and individuals who were affected, and we supported measures being put in place which the Shadow Minister mentioned, including the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, and various business grants and government-backed loan guarantees. But it is right that, as a country, we now reflect on how those schemes were implemented by the government of the day. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we've heard from many honourable members today, a number of people experienced genuine hardship and distress because they were excluded from the schemes that were available. Many of those experiences have been told powerfully throughout today's debate, including by the Honourable Member for Stratford-on-Avon in her opening speech and by my honourable friend, the Member for Montgomeryshire. We also heard a number of other stories about individuals and businesses from constituencies across the country. My honourable friend for Truro, the Honourable Member for Ely and East Cambridgeshire, and my honourable friend for Cheshire, who also spoke about the importance of economic resilience and preparedness for the future, an important topic which I'll return to in just a moment. The Honourable Member for Wimbledon, the Honourable Member for Dewsbury and Backley, my honourable friend for Falkirk, who also spoke about the impact, particularly on young people, of the pandemic, which I think has had a particularly lasting effect that we're all keenly aware of. The Honourable Member for Didcot and Wantage and the Honourable Member for Dunbartonshire spoke as well about their constituents and businesses who have been affected. And one of the themes that came up, Madam Deputy Speaker, in many people's contributions was about what we as a country are doing to prepare for the future, to make sure that should a similar crisis happen again, we will be better prepared. And as a government, we are considering how we might better target and reach excluded groups in the future, including through better real-time data collection. As honourable members will know, the official COVID-19 public inquiry is considering how future emergency schemes could be better tailored to modern labour markets. The inquiry recently held public hearings focused on economic support for people and businesses during the pandemic and will publish its final report in due course. The government, including the Treasury, fully participated in the hearings and provided a substantial amount of evidence. We will carefully study and consider any recommendations, mindful of our responsibility toward vulnerable groups and our commitment to value for money. Madam Deputy Speaker, as members in this debate have also made clear, no assessment of the previous government's record during the pandemic can ignore the fact that billions of pounds of taxpayers' money was lost to fraud. It was a failure of monumental proportions, and we are all continuing to pay the price. And that is why, upon taking office, we took action to recoup the money owed, including by appointing Tom Hayhoe as the COVID Counter-Fraud Commissioner. In December, he published his report, and the findings are shocking. According to the Commissioner, COVID fraud cost the taxpayer a staggering £10.9 billion. That is enough to fund daily free school meals for the UK's 2.7 million eligible children for 8 years. Madam Deputy Speaker, of course, on this side of the House, we recognise that our predecessors were responding to a crisis, the nature of which demanded acting at speed. But cynical exploitation of pandemic support was foreseeable. Last year, an arrest was made following an HMRC investigation into a company, Lux Lifestyle, which was awarded a £25 million PPE contract, having been referred into the procurement VIP lane by a Conservative minister and their party chairman. It won that contract despite having no employees, no assets, no turnover, and £9,000 of debt. Whilst Lux Lifestyle did end up supplying some items, they were all inadequate and unusable. And that is just one example. It doesn't begin to scratch the surface of COVID fraud. Yet we have heard no apology today from the party opposite. We have had no apology to this House and no apology to the British people who have been left to pick up the bill. And we will not allow that to happen again. That is why the government has introduced tougher sanction powers through the Public Authorities Fraud, Error and Recovery Act to help recover stolen funds, and why we have rolled out specialist fraud recovery teams to track down suspected fraudsters and recover taxpayer cash. Since coming to office, the government has recouped almost £400 million paid in error or that was obtained illegally through COVID fraud. But as the Chancellor has made clear, this fraud is a fraud against the British people, and we will leave no stone unturned, leave no question unanswered, and leave no fraudster unchallenged until we have cleared up the mess that we inherited. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, whilst we work to fix those problems, we are also turning toward the future, making sure our country is well prepared to face future crises. Much has been learned already from the COVID-19 pandemic, but the scale of the economic emergency facing the country nearly 6 years ago underlines the need to continue embedding these learnings into government's systems and processes. As I've already set out, we have taken tough action to track down the fraudsters who profited under the previous government's watch. We're improving and enhancing the government's analytical and modelling capabilities to ensure that we can better target support schemes in the future. We have launched the National Situation Centre, enabling us to identify and plan for a range of risks and improve our crisis response. We have conducted, through Exercise Pegasus, the largest cross-government pandemic simulation in British history, helping to make sure that we are better prepared than before, that our plans are battle-tested, and that we are ready to adapt. And as the official COVID-19 inquiry draws to a close, we stand ready to study any recommendations and take action where needed. Madam Deputy Speaker, the economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for this country were profound. In response to this unprecedented crisis, it was of course necessary to act quickly for our economy and for our communities. But we know that mistakes were made, and the British people were defrauded to the tune of over £10 billion. That is money that should have been spent on schools and hospitals, and which has instead gone into the pockets of fraudsters and criminals. There will also undoubtedly be wider lessons to draw from the design of support schemes and the impact these schemes had on groups across the economy. As a government, we will continue to enhance our resilience to future shocks. We have set to work on that since the election, and our work will intensify after the official Covid-19 inquiry publishes its final report. We will do whatever is necessary to build a safer, more secure country for the future, and I end again by thanking all honourable members for sharing their businesses and individual constituents' experiences in today's debate.
Manuela Perteghella to wind up.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'm grateful for all the honourable members here for taking the time to come and support their constituents today. The people we are talking about today were not asking for special treatment. They were asking for fair and equitable treatment. They paid in, they followed the rules, and when crisis came, they were left behind with heartbreaking consequences. And I hope that the Minister will meet with the APPG in the near future. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, if we're serious about learning the lessons of the pandemic, then recognition, redress, accountability and change must follow. Otherwise, the next time a crisis strikes, we risk repeating the same injustice. Thank you.
The question is, as on the order paper, as many as of that opinion say aye, of the contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.